I'm reading this book, guys, Breaking the Cycle. I highly recommend it. Tell the young men. Many years ago, a very successful businessman with the appearance of a distinguished gray-haired banker began to see me for counseling. Although in his late 60s, Warren had never been married and actually had never had sex with a woman over 25. He had a difficult childhood, and, as an adult, had coped by frequenting adult theaters, where he would masturbate or have sex with the young dancers. Warren wanted to stop, but he had never known how to change. The prospect of an intimate relationship with a real woman was foreign to him. As he described his sexually compulsive habits, Warren began to sob. "Tell the young men," he said. "Tell them that if they don't stop doing this shit, they'll end up as lonely old men in a dark room with their dick in their hands. Tell them, George." That's where the phrase I pass along to many of my clients originated. I tell the young men the story of Warren, and each one quickly gets the idea that he could easily end up sad and alone in a dark room. My former clients who call or email will often mention that the story of Warren was inspirational to them. They tell me that they don't want to end up that way. Craig and his son. Chapter 6 had an example of Craig, who had fantasized about having a stable of or harem of women. In counseling, he had worked to get beyond the fantasy and was finally able to enjoy an intimate and sexual connection with his wife. Craig continued to have counseling sessions, and one afternoon, as he sat down across from me, his eyes welled up with tears. I asked Craig why he was upset. "I was on my computer, checking the browser history," he replied, "and I noticed that my 11-year-old son had been visiting porn sites." Using a tissue to wipe away a tear, he added, "What do I do?" "This is wonderful," I told him. He looked at me as if his counselor had gone bonkers. "Wonderful? What are you talking about? It's not wonderful." "Your son was going to do this anyway, right?" I asked. Craig thought for a moment and nodded. "Yeah, of course he would. Most boys would." "Okay," I said. "Now it's time to teach him what you most need to learn." I further explained that one way Craig could strengthen his own resolve not to act out sexually was for him to teach his son, through positive reinforcement, what not to do. Many fathers or mothers would yell at their sons or add blocking software to the computer. A few would even try to have a talk about real intimacy between a man and a woman, as it were something they actually knew how to practice with their own wives. "You may not yet have perfect intimacy with your wife," I said to Craig, "but you know enough to explain some things to your son. You can explain the difference between real intimacy with a woman and the masturbatory fantasy of ejaculating onto some fantasy woman's chest or face, which is what he could have seen on the porn sites. You can let him know that, when he's older, real intimacy can be truly satisfying. But with porn, he can never get enough of a fantasy that won't satisfy him." Craig nodded. He understood what I was saying. It would take some courage to have this talk with his son, but we both knew he could do it. Unfortunately, most parents never have the talk with their children. Craig began to see that what had happened had presented him with a wonderful opportunity. "Remember when you and I talked about how you built your story based on your history?" I asked. But Craig responded, "Maybe if I don't say anything, he'll just stop." "Your son is building his story," I said, "and you have an opportunity to influence him to create a positive story about sexuality. Or you can ignore his behavior and say, he's just a boy. But if you do ignore it, he'll probably just keep looking at porn and recreate the same story about sexuality that you did. Craig got the point, and he had more than one talk with his son. The son felt his dad was talking to him man to man. This led in a stronger bond between the two of them. If you have children, your behaviors and beliefs in all areas can have a positive or negative impact on them. If you continue to act out sexually, even if you think you're hiding it, your children can pick up your values and views on sexuality. That process could be subtle, or it could be more obvious. Maybe your son or daughter will catch you going online, or hear your wife screaming at you about your addiction. Remember, your children are in the process of building their own stories about life and sexuality. If you don't want them to suffer as you have, be responsible and do not pretend that your acting out behavior has no impact on your family. Never forget that you are not your story. By this point in reading this book, you understand that the mind fabricates stories as a coping mechanism. What you can accomplish without the stories is usually an extraordinary experience. But getting free of your stories isn't without pain. You may have sleepless nights, wrestling with yourself, thinking you should do porn, find a prostitute, go to a strip club or a massage parlor or whatever. But if you persuade yourself to use the tools you've learned in this book and use them every day, your mind can start to change. As it does, you will need to resort to old coping strategies less, and you will continue to free yourself of shame, fear, and pain. In fact, once you've read this book and have practiced some of the techniques and exercises, your compulsive urges will never be the same. You know too much now. Maybe you slipped and looked at porn or masturbated while objectifying the weather woman on Channel 3. When this happens, it might look like you're right back where you were, but you're not. You have internalized this work, and it is still with you. What your mind will try to do is to get you to completely forget that you learned anything. Don't you remember? Your mind might say, "We had such a good time." But you know that's not true. It might have felt good for a moment, but then it was bad. Or your wife left you. Or you were chronically late for work and missed deadlines. The good news is that if you follow the techniques and exercises in this book, you can stop a lot of your negative stories and be more in the now. It's very important that you notice when you are objectifying or sexualizing. It's also vital to stop for just a few seconds and let your essence filter those objectifying thoughts or the voice that wants you to act out. You must be more relentless than your story. Counteracting your addict's voice is a positive action that can help your mind to change. If you just read this book without taking action, your mind won't necessarily change. Again, you need to take positive actions. Otherwise, the addict subpersonality in your mind will win, convincing you that this is all bull and you need to stop doing the behaviors that have gotten you nowhere. A slip does not need to become a slide. If you slip, your addict may tell you to stop, to just keep going. Since you've already slipped, you might as well do more. But if you start to slip, or you do slip, that doesn't mean you need to continue to slide. What if you were on a mountainside and you slipped? Would you give up and just keep sliding until you fell off the mountain? Or would you try to get a foothold and keep climbing upward? If you slip in your recovery, you can still stop right there and just keep climbing. You might have some ground to make up, but you can do it. You have the tools. A crisis can be a gold mine. That may sound contradictory, but it's true. For example, if you're triggered and you successfully resist, you'll be less likely to be triggered next time. We all live in worlds of chaos and unpredictable moments. When you are prepared, you can turn what could have been a slip into another positive step in your recovery. From field glasses to hacky sacks. When I first moved into my counseling offices, I experienced a possible slip turning into a positive step. There was a high school nearby, and I could see the athletic fields from my office window. I glanced out the window and saw the girls' soccer team running in rows of two, doing a sidestep and continuing to run. Immediately, my usually quiet addict subpersonality went into cheerleader alert mode. "We're in luck with this office view," said my addict subpersonality. "Now all we need to do is remember to bring field glasses to work. Imagine the view then." "No," I said to my addict subpersonality. "No field glasses." At that point in my recovery, it was relatively easy for me to say no to my addict subpersonality. But I wanted to go further than that. So I asked myself, what else? What else can I do? I immediately drove into a sporting goods store and asked the sales clerk what to buy for a girls' soccer team. The sales clerk suggested those small sand-filled hacky sacks that kids like to toss around. Later that day, I walked onto the practice field adjacent to my office. I felt like a mature adult. I found the girls' soccer coach and presented him with a case of hacky sacks for the team. The coach handed out the hacky sacks and the girls excitedly began kicking them into the air. As I stood there watching, I could see that these were just normal girls. Some of them with pimples, some of them with braces on their teeth, and others just giggling like the kids they were. The point is that I saw them as real people. I had ceased objectifying. I had taken action and gone past the cheerleader syndrome. Simon tells the young men. 50-year-old Simon was married and the owner of a high-end auto dealership. He used to have a weakness for topless bars. In counseling, he had learned techniques such as first thought wrong and red light guy to stop any negative impulses in their tracks. Simon wanted to acknowledge a good sales month with his sales team. The problem was that these were younger guys who wanted to celebrate by going to a topless bar. Although Simon may have been able to go to a topless bar and resist acting out sexually, for example, by then visiting a prostitute, he knew that some of these younger guys could develop the same sexually compulsive behaviors that he used to have. Simon also knew that if he went to the club with the young guys, the 19-year-old girls giving out lap dances would gravitate to him. They would sense that Simon was the boss and the one with the most money. That would take even more resisting on Simon's part. What could he do? Simon decided to treat his sales guys to an incredible dinner at an amazing steakhouse. During the dinner, he would explain to them why he chose the restaurant rather than the topless bar. He would tell the young men about his addiction and offer his help and support should any of them want or need it. This plan worked well for Simon, and in the following weeks, several of his salespeople spoke privately to him about their own issues with sex addiction. There will be times when you're with another man or men, and the "we're just being guys" attitude will pervade your interaction. If you don't share the joke about wanting to have sex with the woman with big breasts, it may seem as if you're not being a man. The truth is that those guys are stuck in their child stories of objectifying women, while you are being an adult man. Real, grown-up men learn not to treat women as objects. What to say to a possible sex addict? I'm not saying that you need to search out people with possible sex addictions who might need your help. But it would be helpful for you to be aware if there is someone in your life who could possibly need help in this area. It might be a friend, relative, or a colleague from work who might say, "Can I tell you something in confidence? I seem to have a problem with porn and I can't stop." that person is asking for help. You may have a friend or a colleague at work who you know is lost in sexually compulsive behavior. Because you have acted out sexually in the past, you may recognize the signs. You now know that this person is in danger of losing his family or job, or both. If it feels right, you can gently approach this person. Remember, it's not your job to help others. However, there is no shortage of people in need of help, and if you want to learn more about your own sexually compulsive behavior, it's a great way to do that. A great way to do that is by teaching others what you've learned. If you do approach such a person, do not be judgmental. The fact that you've been able to stop your sexually compulsive behavior doesn't give you the right to judge others. In an effort to help, you can offer your own experience. Often, the other person will instantly refuse any help and claim that he doesn't have a problem. In that case, you don't need to go further. On the other hand, if the person responds, "You suffered from that?" then you have an opening. Let's say that you have your brother-in-law. You say that you know your brother-in-law is using porn and that your sister is getting ready to leave him. If you feel nervy, you could take him aside and explain that you know something about sexually compulsive behavior because you've gone through it. If you share a confidence, the other person may be more likely to open up. That is the person to help. When you do have an opening, you need to be careful to tell the person only what he can handle. For example, you could ask about his history. Then you can bring up the idea of his history, leading him to create sexual stories that aren't necessarily true. If he doesn't understand or is unwilling to hear what you're saying, don't try to bombard or berate him. If the person is receptive, you might tell him how you dialogue with your addict, and then share a few insights you've gained through using this technique. In subsequent conversations, assuming the person continues to show an interest in what you're saying, you could briefly describe a few techniques he could practice to get started. For example, when triggered, the person could put a hand on his heart and say, "I do not need to act out. I want to have a positive relationship with my wife." Of course, he could have his own version in his own words. You could explain what else. When the person is triggered, he could ask himself what else he can do besides act out sexually, which would lead to shame and pain. If you have more discussions with this person, you might explain additional techniques such as first thought wrong, blue sky and high heels, and red light guy. It's important to remember that you are not the person's therapist or counselor. You are talking as a friend. Let me repeat, do not judge. Maybe you're no longer acting out sexually and you feel proud or even arrogant about it. It does not help another person if you talk down to them. Instead, this interaction is about explaining what worked for you. If the person is open to suggestions, he will tell you. If not, you can let it go. In my experience, the other person will say, "Tell me more," about 50% of the time. Another 25% may call you next week and ask to hear more. The other 25% don't want help. They may come around at a later date and seek help from you or others. Or they may end up being miserable, getting divorced, or losing their jobs. But you can't help someone who has no interest in changing. The person who is receptive will give you cues regarding what he needs to hear next to be helpful with his particular situation. If red light guy is needed, you tell him that one. If he says, "Oh, it came out of nowhere," you can explain blue skies and high heels. If he's walking around a mall every day just to look at women, describe how you do the beard test and don't need to look twice at a woman. If another man belittles you for not sexualizing women, it could lead to an opening for you to describe how amazing it is to have real intimacy with your wife or girlfriend, and how the sex is better and more fulfilling than you ever imagined possible. Whether or not the other person follows up on what you're saying, by trying to help others, you remind yourself of what you've read in this book and of all your own accomplishments. Exercise. Help two people. Your last assignment is to help 2 people you think might be acting out sexually. By doing this, you will also be helping yourself. In fact, what you can pass on to others could be the most important technique this book has to offer. If you remember anything from this book, remember, what else? What else can I do right now instead of acting out? When you're describing this technique, tell those you're helping to just start practicing. Just start saying it. Let them know not to wait until they want to act out. They should try saying it when they're not triggered, so they'll be ready. Explain that when they're seized by the impulse to act out, they may not have time to think. But if they start practicing now, they will remember. It may not work the first time or the 5th time, but it will eventually work to think to themselves, what else can I do besides act out? Can they play some pool, watch TV, eat candy? What else can they do that won't destroy their life? If there is only one thing you can take away from this book and share with others, it's this idea of what else. By using it, the sex addict gives himself choices. Remember, your mind is entrenched and your story did not start last year. It started when you were young, but you can change. If you tell yourself you can't, that's your story, your mind talking. If someone else tells you they can't change, then that's their mind talking. Remember, there's a part of you inside who does not need to listen to your addict subpersonalities. There is an essence of you who can take a stand and say, what else? Go ahead, say it. Start right now. Say, what else? Then help 2 others and help yourself in the process. Boom! That's the book, guys. It's the final chapter. Highly recommended. George N. Collins and Andrew Adleman. Check out the book, guys. Breaking the Cycle. This is it. Because I'll confess openly, publicly on my YouTube channel, I have struggled with sexually compulsive behavior, okay? Breaking the Cycle. That's the book you need, guys.